hi there, late 80s ill-informed, highly paranoid parent. Life can be stressful, can't it? Nowadays, there's just so little time in the day in which you could teach your kids valuable yet somewhat condescending and hypocritical life lessons. However, worry not, because some company you've never heard of before, whose business model isn't officially sanctioned by Nintendo, wants to talk to your kids about drugs in the form of an incredibly cheap-looking NES cartridge. What could possibly go wrong? When I think about unlicensed developers for the NES, there's something of a pecking order. Tengen, which was essentially a pseudonym Atari used, stands firmly above the rest, releasing quality titles like, for example, Pac-Mania, and arguably the best version of Tetris. Beneath them is Codemasters/Camerica, who are responsible for the extremely solid Micro Machines and Fantastic Dizzy ports, as well as the much sought-after Aladdin Deck Enhancer add-on. But after Camerica, it really just devolves into a soup of very poorly developed games with few really standing out at all. Just a few of the companies occupying this lowest tier are American Game Cartridges, American Video Entertainment, Active Enterprises, and the subject of today's discussion, Color Dreams. I'd really love to explore their history as a company in a future video, as they really do have quite an interesting story, but just to briefly highlight their work, this company released such forgotten titles as Captain Comic, Challenge of the Dragon, and eventually under the Christian game label Wisdom Tree, the infamous Bible Adventures and Sunday Funday. For today's review, however, we will be taking a look at one of their earlier titles, Raid 2020, released in North America in 1989 and Australia in 1990. When I first came across this game, I was just struck by a sense of irony in the fact that Color Dreams, who had previously published Joy Van's mess of a game Master Chew and the Drunkard Who, was trying to make some sort of moral statement to kids who were unlucky enough to have purchased this game. That being said, though, it's not so much offensive as it is utterly hilarious, in the way that it portrays drugs as an evil that, not only according to the game's opening story, transcends the boundaries of race and economic standing, but also the very fabric of time. Now this is all really crazy, but it must be said that the game is far less condescending than the NES's other unlicensed anti-drug game, Wally Bear and the No Gain. There also seems to be an attempt on the part of the developers to reference the Justice Department's now famous Winners Don't Do Drugs screen, which patrons of late 80s through early 2000s arcades will no doubt recognize, with the game's own statement, Winners Fight Drugs. One final note on the game's premise is that it's remarkably similar to the arcade title Narc, which was released only a year prior, and I assume that this game likely drew a great deal of inspiration from that title, which, though I have not personally played, is generally considered to be something of an arcade classic. As we are about to see, however, there is a reason why Raid 2020 isn't a classic in its own right. Disregarding the crazy story as humorously over the top, the game has a lot of problems in its execution. The game's controls are fairly unique from what I can tell, but unique doesn't necessarily mean good in this case. Up and down on the D-pad actually move you up and left at a 25-degree angle, and down and right at the same angle respectively. Stranger still, up and down override any other directions which are simultaneously entered, giving the very disorienting result of up-right commands producing up and left results. The game also sports the off-maligned reversed A and B button rolls, that is to say B jumps and A shoots. It's a choice which I'm not a huge fan of, but which also doesn't have me really bothered either since the game doesn't see much of an emphasis on platforming. So if that's the case, what is the gameplay like anyway? Well, for the most part, it consists of awkwardly making your way through side-scrolling levels while trying to meet the level's objective. It's usually killing all the enemies in the level, though there's some variety thrown in, like needing to locate a keycard in one instance. Unfortunately, in more than a few cases, the objective system doesn't actually work the way it should. In the first level, for example, some enemies don't actually appear until you've already tried to beat the level once, or died. When a game encourages you to kill yourself, it's usually a pretty bad sign. But it's even worse in a game like this, where the level of difficulty is set so high that there really isn't any room for intentional deaths. The game's difficulty comes from primarily two major aspects. The first of which are the controls, which given my description from earlier should be rather self-explanatory, and secondly the enemies. Though they begin off mild in the first level and feel like a good challenge, once you reach the second level, which is a vehicle-based mission, the difficulty gets cranked up to 1000. The main offenders here are invincible turrets which shoot off powerful and quick blasts, and the special helicopters near the end of the level, which not only take many hits to destroy, but also deal massive damage if they get anywhere close to you. Also hindering your progress in this level are insta-kill rocks, control-breaking tides, and logs. It's in games like this that the importance of outside playtesters in more well-produced games becomes evident. The developers likely didn't see the difficulty spike they had created because they were so familiar with their own levels. but for first-time players, the challenge is just too over the top. Unfortunately, this game falls into the category which so many of its ilk do, where save states are a must if you don't want to break a few controllers over the course of the game, and even then I have no guarantees as the difficulty only continues to increase. Level 3, which sees you taking on the streets of the futuristic city of Technopolis, begins with a few things working against you. Multiple high defense enemies run at you, with one of them actually being an instant killing bomb. This pretty much guaranteed a death on my part each time. It's in moments like this that the game really starts to feel like some sort of virtual toll booth that demands you pay a life before trying to progress at all. Now, granted, in this case, there's actually a platform you could ride which would allow you to avoid the enemies. However, this is only a slightly better option because of a bug, or perhaps it's a feature of this game, which causes you to sometimes jump and ride objects, including enemies, but you take damage as soon as you jump off. No matter what you do in this opening situation, you lose. So the difficulty is pretty tough, but there isn't anything inherently wrong with that. The original Castlevania is notorious for being something of an unfair experience, so what makes people come back to Castlevania and not Raid 2020? Well, I'd say that certainly some of the reason can be attributed to aesthetics. The music and visuals of Konami's classic far outclass anything Color Dreams produced. But in my humble opinion, the best thing Castlevania does over Raid is create a sense of satisfaction in fulfilling the repetitive tasks the game demands of you. Though I think a lot of the less talented game developers would want you to think otherwise, there isn't actually anything inherently fun about killing enemies in and of itself. Games like Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Rogue Legacy, and of course the aforementioned Castlevania are actually doing something very special when they make an action you will likely repeat hundreds of times over the course of the journey fun. Just to go along with the Castlevania motif, what about the game makes fighting so enjoyable? If I could point to one thing, I would say it's the weight and physicality of the whip, which is the culmination of three basic design choices, making the whip slow, powerful, and aurally trenchant. Raid 2020 succeeds in none of these, nor does it bring its own interesting direction to the table. Rather, it's just a matter of going through the motions, without any sort of feedback. This is all made especially boring when most of the gameplay is centered around killing enemies. Now, I'm not one to outright call a game awful, because the aspiring developer in me has a tendency to empathize with the people who put time into this game, but I grew so frustrated over the course of this that it's hard to take an optimistic tone toward it. In between its silly over-the-top message and gameplay, I'll leave my gushing about Color Dreams for a later time. For now, I'll just say that Raid 2020 is one of the worst games I have ever played, and left a fairly bad taste in my mouth all the way through. It comes recommended only to hardcore NES collectors and enthusiasts.